Hello, everybody. We'll get started. Thanks, everyone, for joining us in person and online. We've got a few people online too. We've got an awesome mix today of our iwi partners from central and local government, our consultants, and others that we work with across the region. So thank you so much for taking the time today to join us with our special guest, Robert Liberty. So just for those that don't know me, my name is Parvati Rotherham. I'm part of the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee Secretariat, and I'm the project lead for the future development strategy that we are currently underway with. And what Robert's going to talk to us today is very relevant to that piece of work and the other pieces of work we're doing, such as the emissions reduction plan that ARIA's at the back there is leading, and the other sort of localized structure plans and things like that. We can probably learn a lot from Robert's more than 40 years experience overseas in America, doing spatial planning in Oregon and California. So he is a highly experienced professional in that spatial planning, as I said, in local government, and his specialties include urban growth boundaries, residential zoning reform, transport planning and project analysis, and farm, ranch and forest land protection. He's been a speaker and advisor on planning matters across US and New Zealand, Canada, China, Mexico, and other countries. He's got degrees from Harvard Law School, Oxford University, and the University of Oregon. And he's kindly doing this from the kindness of his own heart. There's no compensation given to Robert. So we just really want to thank you, Robert, for taking a bit of time out of your holiday here and coming to talk to us and sharing with us your learnings. So I'll hand over to you now, Robert, if you want to.
Thank you. And thank you for your time organizing this. And since you're rarely told this, thank you for your service to your region and your country, because it's very important for your future. So I'm also indebted to the tech help, including Frida Wells, who's going to actually be advancing the images for me. So next, who I am and my perspective. Well, I'll follow what I think is now the custom here and begin by next. This is my mountain, Mount Hood, Hawaii East. This is my river, the Columbia. Next. And my people, I come not as a cheerleader solely, or as a critic solely, but as someone who's very interested in achieving the outcomes of our planning program. Much of my career has been devoted to identifying the deficiencies and trying to remedy them in what we do in Oregon. And I have had experience in looking at other spatial planning and transport planning programs in other parts of the world and the United States. So there'll be, I have both critical and compliments for our effort. Another very important point is I would never say you should do this, because I don't have a full appreciation of both your history and culture and the work underway and what's achieved in the past. Instead, what I try and do is lay out what we have done, let you look at it and decide what parts might be relevant. And that will be part of the questions and answers. Next. All right, this is what we'll cover. Next. The context and comparisons are a little basis for understanding our region and our state and your nation. I'll start by looking at state spatial planning with emphasis on urban and containment and residential intensification. Next. Then Portland regional government, regional planning, same emphasis on urban containment and residential intensification. Next. Results, what has been achieved, what has not been achieved. And then we'll have next questions, answers, comments, and discussion. Next. All right, a little bit of comparison. Next. So Oregon is a state very comparable in size, and about 80% of the population of New Zealand, fronting here on the Pacific coast between California and Canada. Next. It has many landscapes that would be familiar to you. This is New Zealand. Next. 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 I'm going to let you guess which is Oregon and which is New Zealand. Next. 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 You can keep going, Frida. There we go. The Portland metropolitan region, which is the region comparable, I'm going to use the comparison with Wellington, is actually a bi-state region. I'll be discussing just the part in the state of Oregon. The part in Oregon is about 1.6 million. The central city of Portland is about 660,000. Next. All right, let's talk about the context, which would be roughly comparable to your central government or national level spatial planning. Next. Oregon has a Spatial Planning Act that will be 50 years old next June, but has no equivalent to the RMA. This is very unusual. We do not have a state environmental policy act. All the emphasis was put on spatial planning to address things over the long term, looking at cumulative effects, which is very different than a case-by-case analysis of environmental impacts. Next. So the structure of this, and by the way, this is probably the dullest part of the presentation, so good time to get extra food if you wish. We have a set of state land use goals. We do not have a state spatial plan. Next. And next, we have city and county land use plans, spatial plans implementing the state land use goals. Next. And then we have city and county land use regulations, which must implement. So there's vertical consistency, everything is mandatory. Next. And then we have the decisions that are flowing from this hierarchical framework. Next. There's also state oversight over all of these steps. So there's not just the identification of the goals and leaving to local governments. Everything is reviewed. There's monitoring and enforcement activities as well. Next. We would have to pause it. There we go. Next. This was supposed to be animated. This is so one of the elements of the planning program was to have compact contiguous growth. So what you're looking at is urban growth boundaries for all the cities in the state. There's one city with an urban growth boundary that has a population smaller than this room. So there's no exemptions. We only have two levels of government, cities. You can see the boundaries of counties there. So this is a central organizing principle, but it's one of 18 different goals. Next. There's another goal to protect forest lands because it's very important to our economy and our environment. Next. There's another goal, like your highly productive lands, the new government policy to protect farmland. Interestingly, though, it protects all farmland, not just highly productive. It includes very low productivity forest lands and areas in the desert. Next. And like New Zealand, one of the reasons this is so important is that there is a very wide variety of crops produced at a commercial scale in Oregon. Next. So we've talked about both the identification of urban growth boundaries and what's outside of it. Inside of it, a key element is residential choice and residential intensification. Goal established now 45 years ago. So every community has to plan and zone land for a wide range of housing types. More about that in a bit. Next. In fact, here. So this is the elements that were used in the first 40 years of the planning program. Next. There was a sharp increased amount of land zoned for multifamily in all cities and all urban growth boundaries. Now we use cities and urban growth boundaries interchangeably, even though urban growth boundaries and city boundaries are not coterminous. Next. Minimum lots section size for single family detached was reduced, had to be reduced significantly. Next. This was very important and not much appreciated, I think, outside our state. Clear and objective standards were required for review of all housing consents, and there was a quick appeal process. So no discretionary kind of like architectural design standards or anything that requires interpretation. Heavy emphasis on quantification of all standards. Next. There was regional coordination of housing need and supply, pretty limited and primitive at the beginning, more sophisticated and over broader geography now. So places could not displace their housing need onto another community. Next. In the Portland metropolitan region, which you'll hear more about, there was average minimum residential requirements had to be met. You could meet them different ways, but there was a goal of units per hectare. Next. And periodically, the land supply inside the urban growth boundary was reviewed and updated in order to maintain a 20-year rolling supply. Next. in the more recent period, there's been a significant increase in the state's intervention on the question of housing choice and densification. Next. In 2017, much to the annoyance of Oregon, California got a head start on this one. But in 2017, state law required all cities to authorize granny flats, accessory dwelling units, on all single-family sections in all cities of 2,500 or more. Next. And then this is especially of mine, actually, this area. I've drafted a state model legislation for the Seniors Association of the United States. There are a bunch of poison pills directed at granny flats, and those were systematically removed, taken away from the discretion of local governments. California's continue to go even farther than this, than Oregon. Next. Duplexes were allowed on all single-family sections for cities of 10 to 25,000. Next. And then 2, 3, and 4 plexes allowed on single-family sections in all cities with populations over 25,000, and in all the cities in the Portland metro area, including the small cities. Next. And then starting now, there are affirmative actions to promote market affordable and subsidized housing. So local governments must go beyond removing zoning barriers to actually providing incentives for construction of market affordable and subsidized housing. Next. Next. And then there's enhanced regional housing need coordination, going beyond county boundaries and looking at really housing markets. Yes, this was controversial. I know that comes as a shock to all of you in New Zealand. One of the things I like about this photo I took is that the sign has been up so long that it's become dirty from the vegetation touching it. So we have another round of controversy going on right now because of the requirements I just described to you that were adopted in 2019. Next. In addition, there are requirements of state law coordinating infrastructure, but it's pretty simple. It's not very sophisticated, but the clear point is you don't have urban infrastructure outside urban growth boundaries. And urban infrastructure should be phased with the extension of the urban growth boundary and urbanization. Those things all happen in stages. Next. In addition, there is a state goal to reduce reliance. This was adopted in 1975 to reduce over-reliance in any one mode of transport, meaning privately owned single occupant vehicles. And this is too big of a subject, I'll just mention it here. And these two things, densification and transportation choice, are a key element in reducing greenhouse gases. Next. In addition, there were substantial changes to the way in which public engagement occurred, with an emphasis on the planning process and not what you call the consent process. It was pretty sharply delineated. The picture is not quite as clear as that in reality, but really the emphasis was on both the periodic update or the adoption of plans and not on case-by-case review. Case-by-case review of consents is seen as implementation. So the only question is it consistent with the regulations? Next. It's not an avenue for policy reconsideration. Now we look to the Portland Metropolitan Region spatial planning. Next. So this is unusual. This is the only entity of its kind in the United States. There is a regional government that provides a range of regional services and facilities. Now you do this in New Zealand with the regional councils and a unitary government in Auckland. This is not a general purpose government, but it does provide a large range of services and facilities. And I'm only going to talk about one of them, one or two of them, but the other activities include solid waste disposal, waste reduction, regional parks and green spaces, convention facilities, visitor facilities, hazard planning. But the two key roles are around regional planning, and Metro actually has authority over local governments, and it serves as the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the distribution of federal transportation funds and adopts a regional transportation plan. Next. There we go. So there are 24 cities and parts of 3 counties within the political boundary, which happens to be the same as the urban growth boundary. So you can see them there. And this there's a scale at the base. Now, the larger region is about the size of the greater Wellington region, about 9,000 square kilometers. What you're looking at is this core area within the urban growth boundary and the cities within it. The white spaces are unincorporated urban areas, something distinctive in Western United States, that are governed or administered by a county level government. Next. This is the regional council when I was on it eons ago. You can see my hair is not quite the same shade now. So there are 6 councilors and 1 council president, and they are elected from districts. Each district now has about 250,000 people, and the president's elected across the entire region. Next. I represented District 6 there in the center. It also has many advisory committees. The most important ones, which are included in the charter, by the way, all this was approved by the voters. So it's a directly approved charter government. The Metro Policy Advisory Committee represents the 24 cities, 3 counties, special districts, school districts, port authority, and so on. And then the Joint Policy Advisory Committee on Transportation. In fact, Metro is often called Metro, which might sound familiar to you because there's endless committee meetings, endless advisory committees. In some cases, though, the Metro Council itself cannot take action until the committees have at least reviewed it. But it's only in extremely rare cases that one of the advisory committees actually has any final authority that cannot be trumped by Metro. Next. So it's very similar to the state system, except there is a regional goals and framework plan inserted, and everything must be consistent with it. So Metro actually will review compliance of local governments with its key elements, but Metro does not look at all the individual zoning. That's not what it does or what's in that. It's limited to some basic requirements that are of a regional significance or state mandates. Next. This is the regional framework plan. I'll take just a minute to tell you what you're looking at. The area inside yellow is the urban growth boundary. And this, by the way, I looked at the development of the framework plan here, and there's many similar elements. And not surprisingly, I think, because this happens around the world. The green is an area of rural reserves to be off limits for consideration of urban growth boundary expansions for 50 years. The kind of tan, you'll see some at the southern end, is urban reserves. So those are still typically in farm or forest land, but are candidate areas for urban growth boundary expansion. There's some purple circles or polygons. Those represent a hierarchy of centers from the regional center to sub-regional centers and so on. To the smallest level are transit-oriented development stops. So each light rail stop has a small kind of neighborhood level center. Areas in blue are regionally significant industrial lands. And the dark yellow is high frequency bus lines. So probably pretty familiar with the dark green or some regionally significant natural areas and parks. So it's pretty familiar, I think, and this is what you see developing. This was developed originally by looking at different patterns of growth, which was outward expansion, concentrated growth, keeping the urban growth boundary fixed, or having displaced centers outside the urban growth boundary, like sharing growth out into areas outside Metro's boundaries. And it ended up pretty much with a focus on infill and redevelopment and some expansion. So that's been the case for 30 years now. Next. Now, housing choice and densification, your favorite topic now. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Metro contributed to that statewide effort. Next. So it had a role under state law to implement the urban growth boundary land supply, state housing choice, and densification mandates, like the minimum density targets. It was up to Metro to make sure that was implemented through the 24 cities and 3 counties. Next. Much earlier than the state, Metro said every community, every city must authorize granny flats on every single family section. Almost none happened. And that was because of those poison pills that still were embedded in local regulations. Next. There were regional and local parking requirement reforms. So local governments can do their own thing as well. And the city of Portland tends to be the most aggressive in its strategies. So there were regional reductions in the amount of parking that could be required. So the limit on minimum parking requirements, both for commercial and mostly for commercial, but some for residential. Next. When urban growth boundaries were expanded, Metro got into the practice of saying, you've got to achieve targets, and the targets are higher than anything the state requires. And we'd like a mixture of housing types and overall goal to fit with our objectives around access, mixed use, and now climate change. Next. In 2018, the voters, it's a taxing district. They approved a $653 million, so 1.2 billion New Zealand dollar taxpayer approved affordable housing bond. And then in 2020, next, they approved a 10-year, $248 million a year taxpayer approved housing supported services bond. So that is to enable people to take advantage of housing and housing opportunities. Next. So I'm going to show you this briefly, what an urban growth report looks like, but you can find all this on the web. This is the most recent one. But this is backed by 11 appendices, totaling hundreds of pages. So this work is highly controversial, often litigated. It's become very technically sophisticated. It's become slightly more politically sophisticated. But much of the debates over the analytic basis are over, and the debate, which is a good thing. Now the debate is mostly over the policy choices. So I'm going to just show you some, I'm not going to take you through this because that would be torture and probably not allowed in the Geneva Convention. So I'm going to give you a kind of sampling of what it looks like. Next. Next. So we begin, sorry, it's a little out of order. It begins with an update of demographic trends, which is growth rate, spatial distribution of housing, jobs, family sizes, ages, and incomes. And they use an expert panel. Then there's a review of housing production since the last review to see whether or not predictions have been good. A review of land consumption. Next. Forecast of residential employment land needs and supply through redevelopment, infill, and greenfield. That's the standard palette of housing or land availability choices. Next, there's econometric modeling using an in-house model and considers transport policy investments and climate change. It's a little weak on the latter, but progress. Next. And then there's a look at alternatives to meet the need within all the constraints by state law and politics. And then associated requirements, like if there's a need for more land, urban growth boundary expansion, local governments have to propose, and then that is considered as choices are made. And then there's approvals of master plans for urban growth boundary expansion areas. Next. So this is just a sampling of the kind of analysis in there. So you see a housing build over a 10-year period on the left. The three colors are single family residential, multifamily residential, and mixed use residential. And you can see it's 40% multifamily, 40% single family, and 20% mixed use. But you always have to look at this in context of the existing supply. So for a long time, the need has been to enrich the choice, not replicate the existing distribution, but enrich the choices. Next. This is a map showing development, infill and redevelopment. And infill and redevelopment are actually technical terms. So they're GIS based. It's not just a generic term. There's a way the analysis is done. So the purple shows redevelopment potential and the green are infill. And redevelopment is actually determined based on starting from a ratio of structure value to land value. And sort of a gray area. This is actually a deliberate pun for things like parking. It's developed, I guess, but it's mostly vacant and served by infrastructure. Next. This will be on the final, and you need to memorize this in the next few seconds. So you can see this is distribution. Oops, that was too fast for them to learn, Frida, but this is a distribution chart of housing need by income, right? So I don't know if they're still using it, but when I was there, they used a housing market segment I thought was very good. The housing market segments were family size, age, income. Those were the starting points, and then there was choice preference. So you then match the household to the housing they can afford, and that's both ownership and rental, multifamily, single family. And then that got placed spatially where the supply was likely to appear. I'm not sure they continue to use that. I thought it was very helpful in illuminating how your policies can lead to more income segregation or more income integration. Next. So this is a forecast using the Metro model. This is done from the 2014, I think, Metroscope. And you can see that it's about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Ownership, single family, renter, multifamily, and owner multifamily. And it has a number of units. If you look at the lower right, you'll see Metroscope scenario 1,462. So, I mean, all models do this now, but there are thousands of model runs to try and balance demand, supply, include transportation. Next. So all of this comes down to then a recommendation. Oops, sorry. I think I covered that. Next. From the chief operating officer that has been watching, she's been watching all of this and talking to the president. So it's like none of this ends up being a surprise. Here was the recommendation from 2018, and it called for most of the housing need to be met through infill and redevelopment, but some small urban growth plan expansions. In the upper right, you see a map of the candidate areas that were recommended. And one of them, the upper left, is Witch Hazel Village South, 75 buildable acres out of 150, houses planned 850, which comes out to about 28 homes per hectare, per buildable hectare. So that is both the approval of the area and a performance target to be met. So that's what it looks like, and there'll be one underway now. New update. Next. Just about transportation choices. This is, there's been efforts, something I was particularly interested in to integrate land use and transport. And the fundamental principle for me is transport implements land use. It does not lead. It's typical among engineers to think of them simply fulfilling a service, but in fact, they reshape markets in a dramatic way and therefore help determine development. So this integration is much more, goes through many different levels, much more sophisticated. Next. Next. This is the land use transportation air quality alternative. This is a project I was personally involved in. It developed an alternative to a motorway, and the major alternative was not transportation investments at all. It was changing land development patterns. And it outperformed the proposed highway on congestion, on access, on air quality. So one of the interesting things was, this is a subject in itself, the motorway itself would have cut many arterial roads, lengthening other people's trips, was not considered in the analysis. So I have a long presentation on this in the web and what it means. But Metro actually helped participated in this, and it was the basis for integrated scenario planning as we have used it ever since, and I think across the world, actually. Next. But I would like to say we've followed that example. We have not. In California, the Air Resources Board has set very dramatic goals for VMT reduction and goes much farther than the state of Oregon in implementing that. So I was involved in the technical aspect of this work. But one of the things that they concluded was that despite improvements in technology, that was not going to be, the fleet change was too slow to meet the goals. And so there was a significant share, the greenhouse gas reduction target, which had to be achieved through changes in form, in spatial development patterns, which also would work better with transit, so more mixed use and higher density. And so there was actually a complete change. Instead of using level of service, if you're familiar with that, which is a congestion measurement, it was reduction in driving. was the target. So you had to look at things from a completely new analysis. You can find out more about this on the sb743.org website, Senate Bill 743.org, and this is still being implemented now. Next. All right. A lot of talk about plans and policy. What are the results? Let's take a look. Next. All right. Let me say this first. Oregon is not Oz, okay? Oops, can you go back? I want to dwell on that a moment because it's a very important disclaimer. Nothing is perfect. And this state is not perfect. The planning program is not perfect. As I've said, a lot of my career has been working on everything that's wrong with it. That said, it still has some results that are worth noting. Next. And when you think about the performance of a program, you evaluate it against what it said it was going to do, how other places have done, and its own past performance. Those are the three standards of evaluation, right? Grading on a curve, grading against your objectives, and grading from change from the past. Many years, about a decade ago, is commissioned by the Wallace Global Fund to evaluate sprawl curtailment efforts in all 50 states and all regions and every local government I could find. So these three reports at 800 pages are available to you at shipping cost. I'll autograph them. And if two of you read them, it will double the number of people who've read the reports. But those two people were me and my editor. But it does mean I do have a basis of comparison, at least within the United States, although I also looked at some international examples. Next. All right. First, let's take a look at urban growth boundaries. Actually, you can see it here. This is the part of the Portland Regional Urban Growth Boundary, and the separation between the lands preserved for farming and forestry is quite obvious. Next. This is what it looks like. Well, this is Google Earth, and you can actually see these are multifamily housing in the upper right. Next. Just so you know, it's true for all places. This is a little town of Lafayette, population 1,700. So you don't need a line to see the urban growth boundary there. Next. This is about 60 kilometers from downtown Portland. This is a figure ground. You're probably familiar with that term, architecture. So it shows the built environment in black. This is done by New York Times, nothing to do with the planning program. You can see the urban growth boundaries there, all really obvious. Next. This, by comparison, is the same scale of Charlotte, North Carolina. Next. This is animation showing the 1990s between Charlotte and the Portland region. Again, if you've come to be familiar with the shape of the urban growth boundary, you can see it there on the map and the other cities' urban growth boundaries. And the people per acre is what's shown in the scale there. And you can see there's continuing infill and densification, very different pattern. Next. Go ahead and click through the circles, Frida. So this was done by a professor I know. He used census data just to look at densification trends, taking the same census tracts in comparison, allocating growth over time. So in Charlotte, 7% of the new development took the form of urban densities, and Portland was 88. At the other end of the scale, the exurban, which is 1 to 20 hectares per house, 45% in Charlotte and 1% Portland region. Next. This is an interstate comparison. If there's another state in the country that has a planning program similar to Oregon, it's our neighbor to the north, Washington. The red dots show homes over a decade, and you can see the dots north of the Columbia River, dramatic intensification of development in farm and forest land in the same metro area. And contrary to what people assume back home, what you're seeing in gray are urban growth boundaries. They call them urban growth areas in Washington. So very similar framework, but very different performance in the rural area. Next. This only goes to 2000 and you would see a bit more, but the rate of urban growth boundary expansion is a fraction of the rate of population growth. It's about 7 to 1, right? It's 7 times as much population growth as urban growth boundary expansions. And we have large expansions that haven't developed, which should have been a lesson to us. Next. And looking across the roughly 10,000 square kilometer region inside and outside the urban growth boundary, about 90% of the homes go inside the regional urban growth boundary, 6% go into other urban growth boundaries, and the remaining fractions go into rural areas. A small sliver, green, should not exist, but there are a few houses going into farm and forest areas. Next. This is the most recent urban growth report, and you can see that infill and redevelopment are 76% of the supply of housing need locations in the metropolitan urban growth boundary. Next. So not surprisingly, happens to be for the Willamette Valley, about a 30,000 square kilometer area that has the most productive lands in the state. There's a dramatic drop. This is pretty old data, but a pretty dramatic drop in the conversion of farm and forest lands. Next. And the same thing you'll see in the next slide is a dramatic drop in the conversion of forest lands as well. This is for the western part of the state where the most valuable forests are. Next. So we talked about urban growth boundaries, urban containment, farm and forest land. How about the other parts of the program? Well, in terms of infill intensification and the center's development, this is an area of warehouses near central Portland. This picture is from about 2000. Next. This is the same area today. Again, not unprecedented, but pretty good achievement. And about 30% of the housing units are income limited. That's by far the best performance. There's nothing else achieved anywhere in the state like that, but it's pretty interesting. Next. The sub-regional centers, this happens to be a suburban community, not very impressive. There's a lesson there. There's some redevelopment going on. You're seeing some intensification, but I don't think it's very impressive. And maybe we can discuss that later. Next. On the other hand, a development that's occurred very rapidly. This is a arterial in Portland, about 5 kilometers outside downtown. That was all one-story buildings and parking lots just about 2008. And this has happened very rapidly and coincident with the removal of a couple factors, but one is the elimination of parking requirements. Next. This is another area, and I think this is pretty interesting in terms of urban form. So this is another one of these, another stretch of the same quarter. What you see in the center is a grocery store. On the right is an apartment building, sort of mid-rise tower, which is a timber frame, is ownership multifamily. And to the left is office. And one of the things, sort of the old assumption was that you had jobs first, you attract housing. No, you create a cool neighborhood. Then people build offices to take advantage of the people living in those areas. So you got housing, retail, different types of commercial and housing. This is all within, I don't know, 10 years. Next. So that's been impressive. And one of the reasons I think this has become possible, and again, I suspect this is not unique, is that these are what you're looking at are homegrown developers. Almost none of them or none of them started out doing this kind of infill redevelopment work, much more complicated financing requirements. And they've all become successful because they're now meeting the policy and meeting market demand at the same time. So quite an interesting group of people. When people from outside tried to do development, take advantage, I mean, it's an insider's advantage, of course, people who know the regulations, but these people have learned the hard way about the market and testing the market. Next. So you heard me mention the amount of land zone for multifamily had to be increased. Well, it went up 300% in 4 years. I mean, it's pretty obvious what happened. That was in the Portland region. Next, including across through the suburbs. The average vacant detached single family home section size fell from about 1,250 square meters to 400 square meters. That took a couple stages, but most of that reduction was achieved in about 4 years. Next. The original assigned density targets in all the cities in the region were not all of them met it. They all got close, and now we're way past that. Those are in the rearview mirror. Next. And you can see this is foreshadowed in something you saw before. It's about 40% multifamily housing being built, 40% single family on smaller lots, and mixed use residential development is 20%, which is a big increase in recent years. Next. This is also, the green is greenfield and purple is infill and redevelopment, and that's by year. So tracking this, you can see again, the basic supply is land that's already within the urban growth boundary that's already next to or partly developed. Next. This headline is now unfortunately dated, but that was actually the headline of our what once great newspaper. And it showed a depolarization by income and race directly traceable to the changes in residential zoning, market affordable housing. So it wasn't that we were creating ideal communities and suburbs. The suburbs where a lot of job growth occurred had a big supply of multifamily housing built. And still a certain amount of income segregation there, but still made a huge difference and had certainly a impact on VMT. We're going backwards now because, like you, our housing's gotten more and more expensive. And the central city, which used to be the city of Portland, the location for more affordable housing, is now the most desirable part of the region by and large. So we're getting income and class and race resegregation occurring again, which is why those bond measures were so important and this new round of intensification. Next. This is from the most recent bond measure report. This is the construction bond, 650 million, doing a pretty good job in delivering them. But if all those houses are built, it's more than a drop in the bucket, but it's definitely not a glass half full. I mean, that's just not enough. Next. And on the housing supported services, lagging quite a bit, partly because the revenue is not coming in. Next. So that's everything at a moderated pace, thanks to delay in the PowerPoint. But how about questions, answers, your reflections? That's a very good question because the emphasis has been on qualitative. And part of it is because things like design requirements have all been left to local governments. And in cases, design requirements that are discretionary have been eliminated. So I would, on purpose, it was not an oversight because they felt that they were used to manipulate decisions, right, to screen out things. And California has eliminated design requirements for accessory dwelling units now. So I would say it's a mixed bag. I would say that some neighborhoods have become a lot better because when you see those quarters development, you can get services nearby by walking. And in terms of schools, for example, Portland Public Schools, like other central cities, assume the population would decline. They're now having to retrofit and build new schools. So we're getting more vibrancy. Other cases, I would say it's nothing special. You know, I wouldn't say that a lot of the designs are not particularly appealing. It's sort of standard. You could find similar designs anywhere in the United States, except they'd be on smaller parcels, be mixed use and served by transit. So I'd say there's not much. The qualitative part has been left to the locals, and the results are mixed. One thing, though, I'd say is when you think about the region as a whole, so for example, there's the infamous Texas Transportation Institute does a congestion evaluation reflecting a kind of Texas perspective. So you may, I doubt you have anything like this. I hope you have nothing like this in New Zealand. If you're going 60 miles an hour, and your trip would take 15 minutes. If your trip is now twice as long because going 30 miles an hour, then that's terrible, congestion. But it doesn't actually consider the trip length. So the trip lengths are lower because things are closer together. So in terms of quality of life, maybe not design, but maybe less time in the car and more access to jobs. but I would not make a claim about aesthetics at a state or regional level. Good or bad, really. Yes.
Isabella was just saying that can Robert speak to sort of the smaller council entities and how that the efficiency of smaller councils versus bigger councils, sort of along those lines, isn't it?
And I think also
and performance
also whether or not lack of capacities justifies either it's a source of or justification for failure to comply with higher level government mandates. There's two things that come to mind. First is that when the original planning was done, there were substantial grants made from the state government to pay for planning. And it happened to coincide with a major recession, which people said, why are we planning for growth when our population is shrinking? But actually, it meant that the planners weren't dealing with consents at the time. It didn't seem like a blessing at the time, but it was. So there was freed up time and funding. When the money ran out, though, you still had to comply. So if you had burned up your money by dragging your heels, there were actually enforcement procedures as well. So that helped a bit. With regard to residential intensification now, there is a template regulation, and this has been done in California in the Model ADU Act, that if you choose not to or don't get it done, it goes into effect immediately. And it substitutes for anything that's inconsistent with it in the local. So that would address both foot dragging and lack of capacity. The larger question, though, about the difference in performance has been partly addressed because planning requirements have been reduced for local governments in ways that I think have been counterproductive in some cases. But they did say they're no longer planning grant, or there are planning grants, but they're more modest now, and they're on special purpose as opposed to general planning update. So I think there is a big difference. On the other hand, some of the smaller jurisdictions are slower growing. They don't have as many needs. Not always true, but yes, it's not a level playing field between big and small jurisdictions. But those are ways that I think make sense to help planning grants, standardized template adoption, and maybe a lesser burden. I mean, why would you come down hard on a small community of 2,200, which is not going to play a big role unless they're doing something egregious, like a giant urban growth boundary expansion? By the way, one of the things I didn't mention is third-party monitoring, evaluation, and enforcement is a very big deal in Oregon. There are many organizations that have planning analytic capacity and can use both the administrative law system and public engagement and litigation to carry out enforcement. There's also a special enforcement proceeding. I actually created it by accident by doing it, and they turned it into a law. So this is not common in other, it's a distinctive feature in the United States. You have a lot of NGOs in the planning space. So the home builders, for example, are heavily involved in the urban growth boundary land capacity analysis, and so is a NGO, 1,000 Friends of Oregon. And there are others. League of Women Voters is heavily involved, social justice heavily involved, environmental organizations, Audubon Society. So there's a lot of contributing, and not just opinion like I want, but actually understanding the law and making significant contributions on the analytic level, legal and factual. And that is a critical difference when you look state by state. When you have a planning program that uses and draws on those resources, the performance is significantly better. So I gave you two answers. You only asked me one question, though. So the question is about the relationship between intensification and the provision of different kinds of transportation opportunities, transit, bus or tram or light rail or maybe subway or heavy rail. And does that lead or follow? Because it also shapes development patterns. Well, the context is very important. For those of you who've been to Vancouver, British Columbia, where I've visited often, the level of intensification dwarfs anything you're seeing in our region. I mean, so I can say this because I was there in June. In a suburb like Burnaby, which would be a 1950s suburb about 10 to 15 kilometers from the center of Vancouver, there are 50-story residential buildings being built, 50, and actually 60. And that's not the only location. So you can find towers of 20 to 40 stories scattered across the whole region. You can identify all of those areas by the SkyTrain location. What that does is, because the SkyTrain has, everyone know what the term headway is, time between trains, it's 3 minutes or less, which by the way means they're getting close to capacity. So basically you've taken the downtown market and distributed it over this region. So I noticed when I was visiting Burnaby about 10 years ago, and I saw a train coming, I started to run. All these people headed to the station, no one's running. I thought, oh, that means something, right? Because the train's always coming. So in that case, it's definitely a lead. You also have extremely high home prices, higher than Auckland, about as high as San Francisco with lower incomes. And there's some other things that change the housing market. So in that case, it's led quite a bit. We don't have that kind of market in Oregon. So we've tended to follow rather than it's a project by project basis, but we tend to follow. But all the thinking about the investment is you're going to have intensification or we wouldn't make the investment. So in one case, there was a proposal to run the streetcar. By the way, one of the things that I've learned is that the focus on trying to identify a vehicle to serve a niche is a mistake. And people get focused on the vehicle, not the time or reliability. We care about those things because some things are cooler than others, but actually the users, that's not important. So in this case, we're using a streetcar to do a light rail function. Why? Because the right of way was so narrow, it was on a very steep hillside, and there was an existing track. So that was kind of flexibility in thinking about service. But ultimately, the suburb had a change in governance, and they said, we don't want the intensification that you think has to come with this. And they opposed the extension of the streetcar because they opposed the intensification. The project was canceled. So definitely the investment's made under the assumption that it's going to be concurrent with intensification. So I think it's always kind of a dance, and you can be hung out to dry if you don't get the intensification. The other thing in our region is that partly because it's, well, a variety of reasons, partly more compact, the travel time advantage with transit around the stations is not so great that people make a housing choice primarily on that. So I believe that most of and our mode split is not nearly as good as yours here. You need to hear that from me. It's not close to what you've achieved here. And I think there's always a trade-off between frequency and span. It's one of the issues, and we're getting better at this, focus on frequency and reduce the coverage of the transit system. But I think the other thing is it's the response time from transit investments is slow. What I think we have achieved, especially for the bus network, is we have an overall density increase. In fact, I realized I didn't include that slide. Our residential density is doubled in the urban growth boundary. I mean, it was a graph, and it's pretty obvious. So the whole region is getting denser and more mixed use. That works with everything. But the areas where there's really intense use, where that shortened travel time would mean a lot, are lower. And as we have more commute from home, that advantage shrinks again, right? Which is fewer people need to use the system for that purpose. Yes. I have insights. I wouldn't say I have hot tips for you, but so the question was, how do you achieve a paradigm shift from maybe a vision of a sort of suburban vision, everyone on their half hectare or quarter hectare and single family residential? This has been described, this development pattern is described as part of the American dream, and it's also automobile ownership. What I always say is that might have been a dream, that was never America, because America always had a very high percentage of people who were renters. In fact, it was highest, it was much higher in the 19th century than in the mid 20th century. And many people can't afford the dream. My dream is to have a gold-plated helicopter to take me to work, right? That's fine, but it's not realistic. So what is realistic? So for the market was building for a small subset of the need, and that was very clear. Also, the people who were articulating this vision had a vested interest in that development pattern. It turns out, we've now shown that they didn't really know what the market was or could be because the regulations prevented people from having choices. There's an analog with transportation was, well, people really wanted a bridge here, they'd be swimming the river, right? If there's nothing possible or available, you don't really know what people need. So I think part of what happened was this was adopted. All of this was controversial. All of it was controversial. And over time, it was accepted. So and now one of the things I think is very interesting, and I've seen this a couple times, is because the planning, spatial planning, transport planning was such high profile, it attracted, and all these NGOs and individuals are involved. The level of kind of knowledge on it kept going up, and sophistication. Doesn't mean acceptance, but understanding. I was taking a taxi back from the airport once before the light rail line was built, and the fellow started talking to me about urban growth boundaries. I kind of set it up. I said, "Oh, how's development occurring?" He started talking about urban growth boundaries. Another time, there's a guy. It was at a convention business, something Metro did. We were recruiting for conventions, and afterwards, they brought this food up, and they brought up all the distinctive weird food from our region, including a guy brought an ice cream truck up onto the ninth floor of the hotel, and he was selling ice cream made within the city limits of Portland with, lavender and so on. And I'm talking to a woman about this alternative analysis for major highway investment. And the ice cream vendor says, you need an integrated land use transportation analysis. And he started talking to us about it. So that's the ice cream vendor. So that's that. When you think about infrastructure, you can think about hard infrastructure, but there's two other kinds of infrastructure: what's in your heart and what's in your head. And I think that comes partly out of the controversies, which planners do not like, local officials do not like, but that is when people learn and understand. So I think now, even the home builders say now, this is a couple of years ago, not everyone wants to live in a dense environment. It's like, there's a change, right? There's no one. Now it's not everyone, which is true. So I think just being consistent. There's been a few tactical retreats occasionally. Sometimes I think they were principled tactical retreats. I mean, they had a basis, but I think just steady on is very important. It's another thing. Almost no one asks a question like that, by the way. But another problem is planning takes a long time to implement, and if you keep changing your plans, you'll never implement them. And I've seen this now. I'm also on the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area Commission. Is that you have to stick with it because it takes a while to implement. And if you're constantly changing it and changing policy, you're never going to see results. So after a while, people start seeing the results, and then then people move into those communities, and they have a vested interest. That's their dream. So no hot tips, endless explanation. Use non-governmental entities to speak to this. And we also had a coalition of environmental and social justice groups working on regional planning as well, and that helped. All right, so the question was, how do you develop or find more non-governmental organizations who are advocates for things like intensification or transport changes in transport investments? It's a good question. In fact, in other areas, when I was asked to come in and do consulting, one of the things they asked me to do is to help stimulate NGO development, nothing to do with government policy, but to stimulate NGO development. So that's also a dynamic process, because unless there's something that can be influenced that actually achieves an outcome, then the NGOs are going to drop out. Like, I did all this for nothing, right? It's complicated. And not all NGOs are, enlightened, right? They want bad things as well as good things. Sometimes they teach you that you're wrong. That's always useful. So I think you'll find some migration of YIMBY organizations because it's become very powerful in Oregon. Portland, by the way, the city of Portland went beyond the state's intensification requirement. You can have 6 units on every single family section. They did something, by the way, very clever, not clever. It was tactically smart and good policy. They shrank the maximum size of the building envelope. So you can have small units, but the maximum size for single family, which was enormous, got to be much smaller. So that was actually a NIMBY objection that I agreed with, which was I don't want to have giant houses with no green space. When my neighbor's house was built, before my wonderful neighbors moved in, they are wonderful. My response to it was, it's great. I would have wished it was a duplex for the size of the volume of the house. By the way, remodeling is a great avenue for intensification. and it means revising your building codes. This is really important. You change your building codes to allow adaptive reuse of homes as well. So I think it will come, but one thing you do is to arrange exchanges between NGOs in other countries doing this work and NGOs here. So this evolution occurred mostly in the 80s, 1980s, but a friend of mine, Mike Hauk, was a big advocate for urban green spaces because he also supported intensification. To him, these things went together, right? So, and then we had an advocate for affordable housing and a transportation reform advocate. When we did our first presentation to the Metro Council, we exchanged our roles to make the point. So the woman who was advocate for affordable housing spoke about green spaces. Mike Hout, the advocate for green spaces, spoke about affordable housing and so on. And they said, what? They said, it's a package deal. We have to understand each other's needs in order to achieve an outcome that is best for all of us. By the way, it's not Oz. I'm just reminding you.
Do we
Thank you.